Hello and welcome again to our weekly Bible readings video. This week we're actually going to be covering 2 weeks worth of readings, the week that we're presently in, but then also the week that begins on Sunday, October 27th. And these passages go together thematically really well, so we're going to explore them together. So if you haven't done all the reading yet, that's okay. You can still catch up with what we're talking about. Or if you wanted to wait and go watch this next week after you finish those readings, either one is fine. But I want to draw our attention first of all today to the fact that there is a lot of deception in these chapters of Genesis. Now, we have already read that Jacob is the deceiver. His name literally means to grasp by the heel or to deceive someone. If you think why you would grab someone's heel, it would be to trip them up so that you could then go get an advantage over them. And of course, that's what Jacob was doing as he was being born. He was grabbing onto the heel of his twin brother Esau as Esau was being delivered, and he was trying to supplant him, wanting to get what the oldest child got, whereas he was not the one who had the natural right to the birthright and the blessing and everything that came with being the oldest son. And so we see his deception really take root in that identity as the second son and trying to get that position of the first son. We saw last week how Esau sold his birthright to Jacob. Jacob bought that birthright with a bowl of stew. The birthright was just the natural order that said that the first son was the one who would inherit the lion's share of the father's property. He would get a double inheritance, whereas the youngest son would get the lesser inheritance. And the oldest son then would be the head of the Bet Av, the father's house. He would be the ancestral leader. He would be the one that would lead the tribe or the clan that came out of that family. So it was very important to have that birthright. But we're going to see in these readings that Jacob takes a second thing that goes right along with the birthright that naturally belonged to Esau. And that is the blessing of the father. The blessing of the father was the acknowledgement and the affirmation that what the oldest son had by birthright was now given to him socially and culturally. It was being affirmed that you, yes, were born as the oldest son, but now I, as the prime person in the clan, I now affirm that and give that to you in a very material sense. It was a way to receive your inheritance. And so Jacob gains this inheritance, this blessing, by deceiving his father, but it's at his mother Rebekah's initiative. She tells him to go in and pretend to be Esau. Now Isaac has very bad eyesight, so he cannot see clearly. So she wants him to say that he is Esau and to bring him this food that is prepared from wild game, because that's what his father loves. It will get his father's approval, and then his father will be convinced to then give the blessing because his father is in his last days here. But the deception goes much deeper than that. She has Jacob put on Esau's clothing so that he will smell like Esau. She has Jacob put on the skins of the goats that they cook so that he will be hairy on his neck and on his hands like Esau. And even with all of this, he can't disguise his voice. And he goes in and tells his father that he's there. And his father Isaac notices that it's Jacob's voice. But he says, "But you smell like Esau, and you feel like Esau. You're hairy like Esau." And so it's enough to trick Isaac. And Isaac gives the blessing to Jacob. And here's the blessing. He says, "May God give you the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you." This is a blessing of authority, of riches, and it is one that will mean that he will rule over Esau. He will take God's promise that was first given to Abraham and then passed down to Isaac will now be passed down to him instead of Esau. When Esau discovers Jacob's trickery, he is in a panic, he is despondent, and he asks his father, "Isn't there a blessing you can give me?" We might think, why can't Isaac just undo what he's already said? Why can't, since they've discovered that Jacob did this deceitfully, why can't they just reverse it? Again, they're in a different culture than we are. Things happen differently. There's not the same legal system we have. The word, the bond of your word is so strong that it cannot be broken. And the blessing that Isaac gave to Jacob is essentially a legal contract in the same way we would be held to a legal contract that we signed in our culture. This deception ends up in a conflict between two brothers. Esau wants to kill Jacob, and Jacob has to go and run off to another land, to the land of his mother and his mother's brother Laban. And he has to do this so he will, number one, be spared of Esau's anger and retribution, and number two, he is going there to find a wife, just like Isaac went there to find his wife in Rebekah. There's an interesting note here that Esau goes and marries one of Ishmael's daughters after Jacob leaves to go find a wife among his mother's relatives. And it's almost as if Esau, throughout all of this, is trying to curry the favor of his parents because he knows that he has disappointed them in selling his birthright and being tricked out of his blessing. It's almost as if he wants to try to gain back what was naturally his in the first place. And this, I think, brings us to the point of the whole Esau-Jacob story. And that is Jacob, even though he went by it deceitfully, Jacob wanted God's blessing more than Esau did. And once it was too late for Esau, he panicked and tried to do everything he could to gain it back. This should remind us of anything, to want what God wants for us, to want God's blessing. Now again, I don't think it means we need to go out there and be deceitful to get it. But we need to want God's blessing so that we can join God in His work. Without going into too much detail, we continue, though, to have deceit in these chapters and then conflict that comes because of that deceit. Jacob goes and meets his uncle Laban, and he agrees to work for his uncle Laban if Laban will give him his daughter Rachel in marriage. But Laban tricks Jacob into marrying his oldest daughter Leah first, and then says, you can still have Rachel as your wife, but you must also be married to Leah. Now this may seem weird to us. How could Jacob have been tricked throughout the whole marriage process? Keep in mind in that culture that there was a veil that was worn during the whole marriage ceremony and process. And so Jacob would not have been able to see Leah's face and see that it was not Rachel's face. Again, these cultural elements sometimes can help explain what's going on. But Laban tricks Jacob, and it means that Jacob has to have two wives, Leah, who he does not really love, and Rachel, who he loves dearly. This is going to cause great conflict between the two sisters because both of them love Jacob and both of them want to be seen as the primary wife, as the one who's most important to him. This is then complicated when Leah has children by Jacob, but Rachel is unable to have children. And then they get their maids into the equation, and they offer their maids to Jacob to have children with him. And so they are in a sort of a competition as to who is going to have more children with Jacob and who is going to be loved more by Jacob. Again, that initial deception of Laban ends up in conflict between the sisters. And then Jacob continues to work for Laban after he has worked off his debt of the two wives, which takes him 14 years. He works another 6 years by watching the flock of Laban. Jacob and Laban had an agreement that Jacob would get all of the spotted and speckled lambs and kids from the flock, and that Laban would keep all the ones that were a solid color. And in this, Jacob does some interesting things to try to make more speckled and spotted lambs and kids born, maybe of some questionable scientific effectiveness. And Laban tries to separate some of those speckled and spotted lambs and kids from the flock that Jacob has to keep them from him. They're both trying to deceive one another. And again, this deception causes conflict. Because what happens is God favors Jacob because Jacob is the child of promise. He's the one who's continuing on the promise of Abraham and Isaac. And God does favor him, and he gets enriched because all of the kids and all of the lambs are being born spotted and speckled. But eventually this ends up in Jacob and Laban having conflict. Laban pursues Jacob when Jacob leaves and tries to go out on his own. Thankfully, this conflict is reconciled without anyone experiencing any harm to them or their families. But it's just, again, it shows that when we deceive, we oftentimes will face the consequence of conflict with the people that we have tried to deceive. So be honest, be truthful, and deal with people in an honorable way. So what do we have to say about Jacob? Is he an honorable man? Is he just a deceiver whom we should write off? Like all the other people of the Bible, especially the ones we've already seen here in the book of Genesis, but even those going forward, Jacob is a flawed person whom God chooses to use because Jacob at least is open to the idea of being part of God's plan. We don't have to be perfect. We can be flawed people and God still use us. Now that doesn't mean we use that as an excuse to cover over our flaws and just keep repeating them, but it does mean that God can use us even if we don't always rise to the standard that we know we should be living up to as God's people. So we should try to live up to that standard by the power of the Holy Spirit, not by our own power, but also know that God is the God of grace who will restore us when we don't live up to that standard. And that's who Jacob is. And for that reason, and for some of the reasons that we see in his story, Jacob is my favorite character from the Old Testament. And I just really identify with Jacob and his flawed nature, but his desire to love God. And one of my favorite stories of Jacob's life comes in Genesis chapter 28, where Jacob stops in this place for the night as he's on his way away from his home to go to Laban's home. He stops for the night and he sleeps and has this dream of this ladder or this stairway to heaven where the angels of God are ascending and descending. This is the place where heaven and earth meet. This is the place where God is having God's headquarters in the work that God does for the people of earth. This is a powerful place. Whether this is really supposed to symbolize an actual physical place, or whether this is more a metaphorical symbol to talk about the place where we meet God, where we come together with the God who sometimes seems so high and lifted up. I think it's important to remember, whichever one of those is true, Jacob has a meeting with God. And it reminds us that God is always available to us, and that the veil that separates heaven and earth is very thin. And even though God may seem far off at times, God is always close and always ready to be accessible to us if we will just go to Him and open ourselves to Him and call upon Him. Jacob, in fact, calls this place Bethel, which literally means the house of God. And this will be an important place for the Israelites as they will have the tabernacle rest there in Bethel once they come to the promised land. And this is really the first place of worship where the tabernacle is stationary. And this is a place where people will travel to. This is before the temple is built in Jerusalem. So Bethel has a very important place in the history of the Israelites. And it is a holy place where they see that God will meet with them because God met with Jacob there. But it symbolizes that place of worship. And so that's why Jacob calls it Bethel or Bethel. And we will see that this connection with God is very important for Jacob's outlook going forward. Here God has reaffirmed the same promise that he promise to Abraham and Isaac. He reaffirms the covenant here for Jacob in similar language. You will have descendants who will be as numerous as the dust of the earth. We've heard language like that before. But we have to flip over to the end of our readings for these 2 weeks in chapter 31 to see what kind of effect this really has on Jacob. Jacob says this to Laban. He says, "If the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac, had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed." In other words, he's saying, the only hope I have, the only reason I've been able to find any success or fruitfulness in life, it's not because of my deception and the way I've tried to do things in the past. It's because God, the God of my ancestors, I love that he says the fear of Isaac, the one who has called me and promised great things for me and has made a covenant with me, he is the one who has done this for me. And this kind of God that Jacob is describing is a God worthy of worship. And so no wonder Bethel had such a deep impact on Jacob and eventually have a deep impact on the people of Israel. And I hope that as you continue to read the scriptures, you will encounter that same God that Jacob saw at Bethel. And that encounter will have a deep impact on you and on your faith. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you soon.